Hi.
Hi, hi. Well, first of all, what is your own personal bond with Van Halen and their music?
Yeah, I grew up in New Jersey, and I got a chance to see them on the 1984 tour. I just started listening to Van Halen, and kind of by luck, the shows had been sold out almost immediately the day after they went on sale, and I was able to scalp a ticket and was able to go, and that kind of changed my life in a lot of ways. And I'd never been to a concert like that before. And yeah, I had started tinkering around with guitar a little bit just for fun. And when I saw Eddie Van Halen play, that was kind of a life changer too. For that, I never became a very good guitar player, but I always tried. I always said I always was like the best intermediate guitar player ever. And it was uh, it was something that stayed with me too on a kind of a I don't know, beyond the music. I just was very interested in the personalities and especially the activities of the band. You know, again, kind of beyond. It kind of sounds strange, like beyond the music. Things like Dave was going to make a movie, and Eddie was doing soundtrack music, and so that whole period of time, I was very interested in their activities, and it just sort of stuck with me. You know, but of course, the songs and the music and the concerts were always what made you a fan.
Yeah, we say, well, the you went to the concert and it was a life-changing moment because of Eddie playing the guitar or also other stuff that you well experienced there.
Yeah, I mean, the guitar playing was, of course, extraordinary, and it was so loud and so much an assault on the senses. You know, even I was 14 at the time, and I even remember when David Lee Roth started cursing. You know, he cursed throughout the entire concert. And you know, at 14, you go to a concert at the local high school play, and nobody says anything like that. And then it's just sort of, you know, it was interesting. You know, of course, looking back on it, it's silly now, but at the time, it was like a very big, like it was like a lightning bolt. Like you're like, oh my god, this guy can do any, like he can do anything. He can say any word he wants in a public place, and you know, it just was. They were so good at the arena rock show. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. It was just the leaping from the drum riser, the lights by Pete Angelus, who was their lighting director and designer and the stage director. He did such an amazing job of just making it so larger than life. And you know, I ended up seeing, of course, a lot of concerts after that were good. But you know, that was one of the ones that, you know, I always point to as the best ever. I mean, I would still say that 1984 tour of Van Halen was the best ever, even if I think a lot of people would say, well, you know, the set list wasn't great, and they were spending a lot of time off stage, apart from each other. Like Eddie was on stage 15 minutes, Dave talked for 15 minutes. It was kind of a strange. It was almost like they were trying to stay away from each other while they performed these shows. But it was such a memorable thing for me. It made me a fan for life. I mean, there's no question about it. The whole experience.
Yeah, and then afterwards, well, you had a concert. What did you do Van Halen music-wise? Did you delve into the old repertoire? Did you go with the Sammy Hagar time? What did you do
Yeah, you
after?
know, so it's for me, I was one of those people who became a fan in '84, and then you only have about a year with the original lineup before they broke up,
Yeah.
and that was a weird thing for me because I remember very distinctly that I didn't really want to believe it, that it was going to happen. Like I just kept, you know, you read these things in the press, and there was no confirmation that it was actually happening. And back then, information was hard to get. You'd open Rolling Stone magazine and you'd see something, or you turn on MTV and there'd be a news report, but it wasn't as if you could get minute by minute, like you can say with the internet. And I remember watching Farm Aid, and they said that Sammy and Eddie were going to come out. And I saw that and I said, it's over. I mean, it's over with Dave. But, you know, that was for me disappointing, but I think I was excited about having two records. I think that's the thing that's sort of, I think a lot of people forget that at the time it was so exciting because you had a Dave solo record coming out, going to be produced by Ted Templeman. You had the Van Halen 5150 record going to come out, and that they all came out, you know, early spring and summer of 1986. And that was an exciting time to be a fan. So yeah, I just continued on. And of course I did go back in the catalog as well. I got Fair Warning and Diver Down. And I think, I think the last one I bought was probably, you know, I bought them over a period of a couple of months, probably was Women and Children first, but um, yeah, I was immediately completely enraptured by Van Halen. And that was was my especially again, because I was trying to play guitar was the thing I was super interested in. And, but, I saw Van Halen with Sammy a bunch of times and always had a good time. I joke on Twitter about, making fun of Sammy Van Halen just for fun. But, I think people know it's all tongue in cheek. I always say that I was a big fan of Van Halen and always liked seeing them. I mean, when I went to see them with Sammy, I was always super excited. And went to see Dave solo, I was excited. So it was always just a great thing and a special part of my life.
And then you have the 5150 album. What did it tell you in hindsight that the band actually continued their huge success and scored #1 albums? What did it tell you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the thing that was really interesting was that at the time, Van Halen, I know people will sometimes argue with me about that, but it felt like Van Halen got bigger in some sort of ways. And the measure of that, you can look at the MTV videos with Roth, and they were dominated MTV in a different sort of way with Roth. But I don't think it's debatable that the 5150 tour was played to more people. I mean, they played 3 nights in New Jersey in a row. They played multiple nights in San Francisco. I mean, it was just I just remember there was just this sense that they had gotten a little bigger, at least noticeably bigger. And then, the thing that's in retrospect probably wasn't as noticeable to me as a kid, but Roth was only doing 1 night, where Roth would come and play, he'd play Nassau Coliseum in New York, or he'd play in Louisville at Freedom Hall or wherever he played. But it was only 1 night where Van Halen was doing 3 nights at these places. And I think the thing that for me that you sort of realized is that beyond the fact that Eddie was the songwriter, which was obviously hugely important, beyond the fact that he was the amazing guitar player, and they plug in this new guy, Sammy, and, they had the brand. I mean, I think that was the thing that as a fan at the time, I don't think it really made sense to me in that way. I was too young to probably understand this, but, the David Lee Roth brand was nothing compared to the Van Halen brand. The Van Halen brand had been built over a period of years, Alex and Eddie, and of course Dave and all the, Mike, but they had those albums, and that's the thing that the band kept going. And those guys were able to make that transition, that rare transition where you have, not a lot like AC/DC and comes to mind, but there are a lot of bands who just never really are able to integrate a new singer, and it becomes a worthy thing of what had come before. Or if they do integrate another singer, it just becomes so different that it just becomes almost a different band to people, and I think there was some of that in retrospect. People look back and go, oh, well, Van Halen changed so much. But I don't, at the time, I mean, that was my recollection of it as a fan starting in '84. You went from there's just more keyboards. And of course the songs, there were, some of the songs on 5150 are definitely much more melodic and much more ballady than it was ever been on 1984. But there was just more of a sense of, I think it was kind of a continuation of where they were going in '84 compared to like me. I didn't think back like what happened to the Van Halen 2 sound. But, if people who were, 10 years older than me, I think that was definitely a thing for them where they were like, I liked Van Halen in 1979. What's this new Van Halen? I don't like this new Van Halen.
Yeah, but I think maybe like saying, I think prior to 1984, I think Eddie was started experimenting with keyboards, and I think
yes,
once
many
David
times.
Lee Roth was out of the band, he felt more freedom, perhaps. So maybe it was the natural way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think the keyboard issue is really, really important. I think people don't always recognize how much keyboards were used on the early records. So if you think back to Women and Children First, I think people know that Eddie played the Wurlitzer electric piano on that. But on Diver Down, let's just go there. There's keyboards were done on a mix of Secrets that came out as a single. So they actually recorded keyboards for Secrets, which you can't really hear on the record, but if you hear the single mix, you can hear it. Dancing in the Streets has keyboards. On Fair Warning, there's actually keyboards buried in the mix on So This Is Love. If you go on YouTube and listen to the isolated tracks, you can hear there's a little bit of an organ, which is just they added to kind of to flesh out the bass. But so Eddie had been, Sunday Afternoon in the Park had been adding keyboards, and it was almost as if it was building towards that. And I in doing the book with Ted Templeman, he and I talked a lot about this. And, he was always of the mind at that time that he was never against Eddie playing keyboards. He just thought that when he heard Jump, he thought it was such a departure, which I think it is, from their original sound, their quote unquote the patented Van Halen sound, that he was uncomfortable because he thought there was going to be a pushback from fans. He thought it just was not going to be like, people are going to be like, what's this new Van Halen? But, you know, he always talked about how Eddie, you know, he always, you know, Sunday afternoon in the park, he was never, from his perspective, he was never like, I don't want you playing keyboards. He just thought this song might be too far pushing it. But he, you know, in the book, his autobiography, which I wrote with him, he gave, I think, full credit to Eddie at the end of the chapter. We talked about 1984, we wrote, and he said, you know, I was wrong. Eddie was right. It became an anthem. He said, you know, and that's what happens sometimes in relationships with music. You have an opinion and you're wrong. And he's like, you know, he said that Eddie deserves credit because he had a vision for the song, what he thought it was going to sound like. He thought it was going to be a Van Halen song and the way he envisioned it. And he was right. And you know, so, you know, the keyboards, I think people should really keep in mind that they had been going, you know, again, fair warning, there's a lot of keyboards. There's more keyboards than people understand, I think, on Diver Down. And so there was a lot of keyboards involved. And then, of course, you just push to the kind of the climax of that, which would be probably around, you know, OU812, which is probably the most keyboards, probably even more than probably you know, Foreign Lawful with Right Now and things like that. I think that's probably the peak keyboards was 1988.
And then what does it tell you about the artist Eddie Van Halen, that he was well known for his guitar playing, and then he actually wants to explore this instrument too and actually come out with it? And what does it tell you about Eddie Van Halen as a songwriter and as a musician?
You know, I think it tells me that he was somebody who really did believe what he said. He said, you know, started saying in the 1980s that I'd rather bomb with my own material than copy someone else's, and kind of his displeasure with some of the cover songs on Diver Down and some of the ways that they had done other people's material. You know, I think this was the dynamic in the band and with working with Templeman, was that there was a lot of, you know, some of this sense like, yeah, like the Jump and I'll Wait, some of that really out there keyboard stuff. Let's not do that. Let's do this other material instead. And I think it just shows he had a vision for his music and believed in his music. And I think that's the thing. I think he actually, you know, I don't think he would ever have wanted to see like 5150 bomb or fail or something like that. But I think it was a willingness to say, this is the type of music I make. This is what I like. You know, and Templeman told me that they had a long, you know, kind of a very impassioned discussion. And he basically said, this is my music. Don't tell me it's not Van Halen music. This is my, you know, this is what I'm writing, you know, and kind of trying to convince Ted that we should do Jump. And Ted was, you know, eventually convinced, obviously, and they did it on the record. But that was part, I think, the daring in some ways to do that. You know, I don't think it's wrong to think that there could, you know, it could have backfired. I mean, it could have, but it didn't, because the musicality of it and the songs were too good. And that's what it comes down to. When you have a great songwriter and you have an artist of that level of technical gift, it's kind of, you know, kind of hard to fail. You know, that's the thing. It's like, but it could have. I mean, it could have. It definitely was. If you listen to, you know, Love Walks In, has almost nothing to do with Unchained. You know, it's just they're nothing. They're almost totally dissimilar. So, you know, God bless him for that. I really, you have to admire him for having his commitment to what he believed was right.
Last question about Jump before we go into the roots of Van Halen. Once the song was recorded, what did Templeman think, and what did other people think once the song was recorded?
So Ted and I talked for hours about this. So Ted's recollection was that there was a demo that he heard a couple of years before Van Halen recorded Jump for real for 1984. And he was just like, it's just whatever. Like, Ed is just doing this thing with keyboards. He's like, it's not really suited for Van Halen. But it was not finished as a song. You know, the thing that Ted also really emphasized to me is that, you know, it's never a song until it has lyrics and a melody. So he would say that, you know, Ed would sometimes present this idea that I wrote a song, and that's sort of shorthand for saying I wrote the music for the song. And he said, you know, that's with an instrumental album. Yeah, you've written the song, but you have to have a vocals and a melody, and that needs raw contribution. So he said that when they re-recorded it, basically Eddie, Don Landy, and Alex stayed one night at the studio and recorded it again. Basically, Ted was kind of heard the demo again, the old demo, and was like, I don't know. I don't really like it. And they were just said, well, we don't care whether Ted likes it. I own the studio. I'm going to record it. And they recorded it. And then they called Templeman and they said, come up and listen. And he was like, wow, that's really amazing. Now, this is where people kind of, I think, when they read the book, may have, maybe they sort of missed the thread, which was that Ted thought it was an amazing, the way they recorded it and the way the new version of Jump came out, which is basically pretty close to what's on the record from what Ted said. I mean, they did stuff to it, but it was pretty close. That he just didn't think it was right for Van Halen, right? He said, it's an amazing song. It's a great pop song. They did it so well, but he said, I didn't think it was right for Van Halen. So another artist, right? He would have been like, oh yeah, like maybe I'm just making it up, like, oh, I don't know, Rick Springfield or something. He would have been like, perfect Rick Springfield vehicle, do it. And again, I'm just making that up. He never said that to me, but he said for Van Halen and the hard rock, heavy metal sound of Van Halen, he said, I didn't think it was right. And so, but then after he heard that, that's when he said, he went to Roth and said, look, I know you don't like it. I'm not crazy about it for Van Halen. There's something here, work on it. And that's where Roth sat down and wrote the lyrics and the melody. Wrote the rest of the song out, and it became a song. So again, that was, I think, an example of Eddie and Alex and Don Landy kind of in the studio themselves. And that was part of the tension that went on with 1984, was that Eddie had this new studio and Eddie was basically taking more control of the production of the record. I mean, that was really the thing that, and Ted realizes that obviously in retrospect, that was what was happening, was that, when you own the studio, you could do whatever you want. You can control the sessions. And so, when you're working at Sunset Sound or Amigo, which was the Warner Brothers studio, there were set times you were there. And of course you could come in at night and work, but basically there was a control of this. The producer, Templeman, had control over the session, which was going to work from April 1st to May 1st. This is when we work. And then of course, when Eddie had the studio, it was open all night and all day. And that caused different problems down the road for the making of the record. But, the other thing I think is important for people to understand is that what Ted told to me, he said, Ted said, I know that if we were working in Sunset Sound and we had limited time, it never would have happened, because he said that those guys stayed in there and basically tinkered with it, and then they recorded after they worked on it. In other words, he's saying that like being able to record it, listen to it back, play it, and then finally where they got the final version that I shouldn't say final version, basically the tracks that ended up on 1984, which they played for Ted that night. He said we did a lot of stuff after it too, as well, with sort of mixing it and sort of changing some of the solos with the kind of comping together the guitar solo. He said, if we had at Sunset, we would have had to get out, like, because you have to, like, the Stones are coming in, we got to get out, or Joe Walsh is coming in, we have to get out. So he said that was a big advantage of having 5150, was that you had unlimited time to work. There's a flip side of that, but that's the jump story.
And just let me get it straight. You said Eddie that's mainly wrote the music, and David Lee Roth, and then afterwards Sammy Hagar, they wrote the melody lines and the lyrics. Yeah,
I mean, I think there were probably times, I should be clear to say that there were times when you listen to some of Eddie's stuff, of course, Eddie implied a melody line in some of his music, but the vocal melody, Dave had to working with Templeman a lot of times too, because Ted was a singer in his band when he was a musician, had to refine and write the melodies out and then write the lyrics. Right. So that was just Ted trying to explain to me something that I kind of missed, is that even if you have written a perfect instrumental demo, it still doesn't become a song until somebody comes up with and that's where he was trying to say that it was the both of them together, because Jump was such a great hook. Just everyone can kind of relate to the idea, just take a chance and jump and go ahead and jump. And he said it was just so perfect because it was something that conveyed so much emotion and information to people when they heard the lyric, but also it was so simple. Like you could just sing along in an arena, but yet it had this message of kind of like, hey, get out there and go for it and stuff like that. And people really related to that. So he was basically saying that, if we just put Jump on the record as instrumental, people would have been like, oh, that's cool, Eddie's playing keyboards. Like, if he tacked it on, everyone was like, that would have been that's a really cool thing. But without the the lyric together, that's what made it the #1 hit. Obviously, the two pieces together. That's what his point was. And, Eddie obviously did the music, and then Dave wrote the lyrics.
Yeah, and then Jump actually might have, it's also a jump for the band Van Halen.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, let's go back. Eddie and Alex, they lived, I think until 1962, they lived in Nijmegen.
Yep.
I think they were born in Amsterdam. When they came to America, what was it like for them?
Yeah, the unfortunate passing of Eddie Van Halen, there's been more focus on, I think, Eddie's early childhood than was probably before. When they came to the United States, from what I understand, they came because had relatives were there. I've always been kind of gone back and forth with people telling me different things. I'm still not sure whether it was, I initially thought it was Eddie's mother's relatives, and then I've been told it was Eddie's father's relatives, but there were relatives who had moved to California before them and kind of said, come to California. And from what I understand, Jan, their father, who was a musician, was seeing kind of less opportunity in Holland, and so was thinking that if he came to the United States, he could basically have more opportunities to play music. I mean, LA is a huge city, obviously lots of nightclubs and lots of orchestras. And so when they arrived in 1962, they came famously with about $50 American and a piano. They took a steamship, and then they came across the country, I believe by train. They came across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. They settled in Pasadena. And they move into an apartment. They don't live in their famous house on Las Lunas until about 1966. And what quickly became apparent is that, Jan didn't speak English. None of them spoke any English. And Jan kind of maybe was not quite aware of the fact that big band music was really, he did it as a jazz and big band player, and was really kind of passe at that point. I mean, it wasn't very popular anymore. And so actually one of the first jobs that Jan had was being a dishwasher at a hospital, and had to walk. So he didn't have a driver's license. And so from what I understand, in Holland, you may know that a lot of people ride bicycles, and it was not common necessarily to have a driver's license. And so he walked. And so Eddie talked a lot about that, how they and Alex talk about how they, had this idea of the land of opportunity, but it was, it was fairly tough. Their mother cleaned houses. I mean, it was very blue collar. And the other issue was that the brothers spoke no English, and they went to school, and they were bullied a bit. I think Eddie probably more than Alex. I think Alex kind of quickly learned how to take care of himself. I mean, I never met Alex before. From what I understand, he's a pretty imposing person who's not going to put up with crap from anybody. It's just not his way. But, Eddie interestingly as well talked about how, so this is something interesting too, as well as in the United States, there was racial segregation in schools. And, that had largely been eliminated as we entered the 1960s because of the Supreme Court ruling. But from what I understand, there was still sort of an informal segregation, basically like in a schoolyard where teachers would just do what they wanted. And Eddie was put with, from what he made it sound like, with the black students. And again, I don't think it was sort of like there's a wall built around them or something like that, but it was basically like, you go over there with them. We keep the white kids over here and the black kids over here, because Eddie didn't speak English. And so Eddie talked quite a bit about how the black kids were nice to me. They basically took an effort to, because I was in there with them, and, talking about his difficulties with being a non-English speaker. The other thing that's come up is interesting as well, which is that his mother was Indo-Dutch. And so she, Eurasian, and she looks definitely, does not look Caucasian. And so that was the other issue as well, is that, the brothers, have that on their faces, so to speak. And so there was some talk about that. Eddie has mentioned that they were, some of that was singled out as well. And so, there was an outsider attitude, I think, developed by them because they didn't speak English. They were in a foreign country, and they were, they were in theory a mixed race. I shouldn't say theory. They were a mixed race couple, which you've sort of forgotten that was actually a thing where people would get upset, and I never heard Eddie talk about anything happening to their family about that, but it was definitely not probably super, super common to have people who speak Dutch where one, there's this mixed race attitude moving into California. So they were, they're very different. But I think the other thing that's worth remarking about is that, they quickly developed very good friends. I interviewed for Van Halen Rising a lot of their childhood friends, And those friendships lasted a lifetime. And again, as Eddie and Alex became more famous, obviously you're not able to like drive into the neighborhood and visit people. But, you know, I even know that Eddie got to see the brothers. They were through a family of brothers named the Brodericks, and got to see them about a year before he passed away. And he brought them up to 5150 for a visit. And these were guys that grew up with him. So I should say too, I think after Eddie passed, there was a lot of talk about this not great treatment of them arriving in the United States. But I should also say that they quickly became well liked, and they had very, very, very good friends in the neighborhood who helped those guys a lot. I mean, just like hauling their gear and working with them, and just kind of supporting their friends. And so, but yeah, I mean, that was the thing that Jan, it never became an easy path for music for Jan. Jan played at basically like Polish American music halls, played polka music, weddings. It was never what I think he wanted it to be. Where I should say in Holland, from what I understand, he was on the radio a few times. They were in Indonesia. He and where he met his wife, he was on the radio there as well and played in orchestras. So, he went from basically having a successful professional music career to a different type of professional music career in the States, where it was much more, it was less status. There was a lot less status in the United States because he was playing music that wasn't, it was like Beach Boys and things like that were becoming popular. And it was just a different sound. That sort of Benny Goodman sound that he probably would have excelled at had passed to the wayside. So, yeah, that's a long-winded answer. That's the stuff.
Really, 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 really interesting. A question about this: how did it form, Eddie? I mean, those coming to America, not speaking English, being bullied a little bit, because when you look back old interviews of him, he mentions it a lot.
Yeah.
Do you think it was psychologically for him hard, and that he carried it with him?
Here's what I think, and I think you still see it today, and I say this with the greatest respect and admiration for Wolfgang. The family became super, super important. And I can't, again, I've never spoken to Eddie. I never spoke to him. I never spoke to Alex. So I can't speak with any sort of certainty about that. My take on it and looking at the situation is that it bonded the brothers so tightly together because they didn't speak English. And you can understand if you're a Spanish speaker in Los Angeles in 1964, 62, you're going to find other people when you go out to the market who speak Spanish. Even if you speak Chinese, you speak Mandarin, you're probably going to bump into people who are Japanese, Japanese Americans. There were not a lot of people in California who spoke Dutch. And there was from what I understand, a small community. There was I'm sure they networked with them and they found them, but there was not a lot of people. And I really think that really bonded the brothers together, where, I mean, they talked about that, where they only had each other. And I said that again about Wolfgang, is that you see him, and I think any son would do this for a father, but he's a ferocious defender of his family. And I think that's to be admired. I think there is that tradition that has kind of carried out, where they were sort of felt like it was us first because we were so different. And they didn't really have, again, a lot of people they could, I think, connect with on that sort of level until they learned English. And then, of course, the other thing is musically, the brothers took piano lessons from a famous, I shouldn't say famous, but a very well-respected Russian piano teacher who was living in Los Angeles, who had been trained at the Imperial Conservatory in St. Petersburg. And so he was probably one of the best teachers in Los Angeles. And the parents, to their credit, paid very good money to have him come, or to have them take lessons. And I think that's the thing too, is that musically they were very paired together. As we know, the famous instrument switch, but also the piano lessons, which was something that continued for some years into the late 60s, where they were both taking piano lessons from the same teacher. And so that, I think, is how that early years affected Eddie and Alex, and just, I think, getting them to become so close. And that's where my heart really goes out to Alex Van Halen. I have a brother, and I don't get to see him as often as I'd like. He lives on the East Coast, and I live in the Midwest of the United States, but I think it has to be a different level of pain for Alex and for losing maybe someone else losing their brother, because they spent so much time together. that isn't super common that you go into business with your brother and you work with your brother. I mean, think about it, from like 8 years old until your 60s, you basically work in a business with your brother.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing. It really bonded those guys together and made them a unit. And that, I think, is the lesson of Van Halen as well for people, is that people came and went, but it was always Eddie and Alex who were the common denominator. Bass player might change, vocalist might change. They had a keyboard player for a little time in 1973. They had a guy play keyboards for them. It doesn't matter. But the point is, like, people came and went, but it was Eddie and Alex together. That was what made Van Halen a unit in a lot of ways. And that were the two foundations of Van Halen.
Yeah, and if you let's say what kind of role did the guitar play in his life when early on? How important was it for him to actually, because he couldn't speak the language,
Mm-hmm.
did he use the guitar maybe to channel his emotions and to come to terms with stuff that happened or happens? Or
yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting thing. That's something I'd love to ask Wolfgang someday about that, what his father had said about that. I mean, I know it became quickly the most important thing in his life. There's a famous anecdote where he talks about how a girlfriend, this would have been in the 1970s, basically said, it's either me or the good guitar. He said, okay, see you later, basically. But yeah, I think the thing about that is that, he was never much of a talker. And I don't mean that he wasn't capable of having, he did interviews and stuff like that. But that was the thing that was so perfect about them partnering with Roth, was that, I think Eddie and Alex were never super comfortable being in front of a camera or super comfortable doing that stuff. They did it to promote records. And obviously there's tons of interviews on camera with Eddie, but it was never something that they loved. And they met David Lee Roth. And of course, like, he couldn't wait. I mean, my favorite anecdote about Roth from Van Halen Rising, and I hope people appreciate this for what this really is. It's incredible. So in 1972, this had been around the time that Eddie and Alex met Dave. Dave was playing in a different band, and I interviewed the drummer, a friend of mine named Dan Hernandez, who was playing drums in Roth's backyard band called Red Ball Jet, and they played together for 2 or 3 years. But they were friends, and they were over at I don't know, Dave's house, and they were eating macaroni and cheese, watching like Lawrence Welk or something, and it was Sammy Davis Jr. came on. And so, of course, in the 70s, Sammy Davis Jr. was a big comic. And Roth said to Dan, he said, man, he's like, one day I hope I get famous enough to be able to go to Vegas and tell killer jokes like Sammy Davis Jr. And like, at the time, Hernandez just sort of said, like, looked at this guy and goes, yeah, I bet you would love that, because he was such a ham. And of course, 50 years later, he's in Vegas, right? He's like doing this thing. He's like playing in Vegas. He's got a residency in Vegas. And so, he was the perfect partner for those guys. I know there was obviously big personality problems, and they never really became quote unquote friends, as they say, but it was the perfect, because like you said, Eddie and Alex were probably, maybe English as a second language, just didn't love that, they weren't easy at conversing. And that's why, I got Roth. I mean, it's just perfect.
Yeah, it's great. And but I was thinking, because I spoke to Michel Schenkel. You know him, maybe, Michel?
Tell me the name again.
Michel Schenkel. He's from the.
Yeah. Of course, yes. I couldn't hear the name. Yeah, of course, yes. Nice guy.
He told me to say hi to you.
Yes, tell him I said hello. He's a great guy.
Now, there was one anecdote that when the brothers played. When Van Halen played Pink Pop Festival, and I think in 1980 Alex, with a nephew or cousin, he went to the Pink Pop prior to the day that they would play, just to check out what it looked like. Eddie, he stayed in his hotel room and he played the guitar, and they bought him some food. And when they returned 8 hours later, he was still playing the guitar. And so what I was thinking, what was it with the guitar? What made him so into that guitar? What did he find in that guitar from early on?
Yeah, I think, that's a pattern that was forever. I mean, I think people talk about that, where Eddie would be, they go out with the brothers. They want to go out for, get some beer in high school, and Alex would always say yes, he'd go, and Eddie would just sit on the bed, and then they would come back in the house at 11 o'clock at night and look for Eddie, and Eddie would still be on the bed. You know, he talked a lot about how the guitar was the one thing in life that never let him down and never disappointed him. And it'd be interesting to hear from someone like Alex or Wolfgang to talk a little bit about, how Eddie, emotionally dealt with whatever, just things in general. It sounded like he was a pretty sensitive person. And that really seemed like, I mean that sincerely, that he was a kind of a soft-hearted guy. And I mean that as a compliment, that, and he just sort of, I think anything that, would happen in life, I think he would be able to remember that the guitar was the thing that always gave him satisfaction. And that story is so funny and so consistent. I tell you, I interviewed a guy named Tracy G, who played with Dio and was a guitar player in the early 90s with Dio. Great guy. And I love this anecdote. When he was about 16, he was able to go see Van Halen in a nightclub in Los Angeles. And he had just started playing guitar, and he saw David Lee Roth. So this was before the show. He's kind of walked in during their sound check, and he was kind of hanging out at the club. He snuck in, and he sees Dave, and he stops him, and he goes, "Oh, hey, you're Dave from Van Halen." And he goes, "Yeah." Kind of like, Roth's not a star, right? He's just like a guy in Los Angeles, but he's in his mind. And he's like, "Yeah, what's going on, kid?" And he said, "I'm a guitar player. How do I get to play like Eddie Van Halen?" And he goes, "Well, let me tell you, kid. When I go over to the house in the morning at breakfast, he's got the guitar and he's eating his oatmeal. Lunchtime, he's eating a sandwich. He's still got the guitar. And dinner, he's got a hamburger. He's still laying the guitar. That's how you get that good. Okay, kid, I got to go." And Tracy, of course, became like, played with Ronnie James Dio for years. And he said that stuck with him. And he was just like, he like walked away and he was just like, "I got to practice more." And he said, like he did. He's like, that's the secret. You just have to practice all the time, because he believed it. And it's true. And Roth was telling him the truth that, and people talked about that all the time, like, on the phone, playing the guitar, just constantly playing. And so, for whatever reason, it gave him a deep sense of emotional satisfaction. And I have to think as well, when I play guitar or someone else plays guitar who's an average person, I'm copying other people's music or just trying to make things that sound good to me, but I don't have this creative flow in me where I can kind of come up with all this stuff. And he always talked about, why one of the reasons why he was obsessed and recorded for 2 days in a row was he had all this music in his head, and so that's the other thing too, is this sort of, you can imagine that if you're hearing all these melodies in your head and you are so musical in a way that's so different than 99.999% of the public, that's part of it too, is that you feel like you have to get it out of you. And that's why you have the guitar strapped on all day. It's not just so I can play faster. It's so I can get these ideas out of my head and into the world, and just basically play them. And so,
and maybe also channeling his emotions. I think when you're angry,
definitely.
you're saying angry stuff, and I think that's
yeah. I think yeah, and I think that's the thing. I think the other thing too is interesting, the dynamic between the brothers. Again, my take, not ever talked to them before, but everyone I talked to seemed that Alex was the dominant brother. Like he was the older brother and the more physical brother. And there was just, he was just the big brother, right? He was much more of an alpha personality. And, that had to be part of it too. I think that's sort of the secret sauce as well, as the tension between the brothers. And that's something that is, beyond Alex ever wrote a book or ever did a real interview. It would be very interesting to hear that teased out, because that was the driving force between the brothers. I heard many stories about, again, about their creative, obviously the collaboration and the great joy is important, but also the conflict. People telling me they saw Van Halen rehearsals at Dave's house, knew one of the roadies and able to come along and stand in the room while they rehearsed. And they would start arguing, it's like, you screwed up. No, you screwed up. And it would be like, Alex would be stand up on the drum. It's like, oh shit, here we go. And like, they sometimes had to separate them. Like, come on, we're not going to fight over the bridge of this song. But that was, it was a super intense thing to them. And so I always wonder that, like you said, the sort of emotions, channeling the emotions. And Eddie was the guy who sort of, I think, he was in a partnership with a guy who was very, very intense himself. And, they wanted greatness and they got it. They really did.
And that's what Aaron also told me. Aaron Musford during the interview, he said they have a really strong bond together. They stick for each other. But they could argue and even fight. Let's say that was he was surprised by that on the one hand they were really close. and on the other hand, they could tell each other whatever they want. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. I think that was a very consistent theme going through all the eras of Van Halen. I know maybe as the final stages with Wolfgang, maybe that became less. They kind of got in their 60s and it became less of a thing. But that was seemed to be a thing. I mean, Mike Anthony talked about that. I mean, he told me, the story about how a couple of times he saw fist fights, and Alex would be hitting Eddie. But would be holding Eddie's hands because he didn't want Eddie to break his fingers. Like he was basically like less concerned about him punching him and more concerned about, Alex broke a finger. He would tape it up and tape it around his throat. But he's like, I mean, seriously, I mean, that's like some pretty intense relationship there about fighting over like a song or something like that to get that mad at each other. So, but Mike told me that story. They'd be separating them and realized that Alex was like, "You just don't break whatever we do, don't break his index finger. We'll be screwed,"
Yeah. No, but I think that's really interesting. And if you look, what was Eddie's relationship with his father Jan?
Yeah, I mean, I always think, without knowing, again, never met Jan, I always think that it must have been a deeply disappointing situation for Jan. I have to think that coming to the United States and not being able to become a success in music had to be something that was very demoralizing to Jan. And again, people should understand, Jan they played all the time, right? You can find there's a few pretty cool old pictures of Jan in a tuxedo playing at a Polish American music hall, or playing at a wedding or a bar mitzvah or whatever. They played, but I think not going from being in orchestras and on the radio in Holland to what happened in the United States had to be demoralizing to some level to Jan. And I think for Eddie, he talked a lot about that his father would cry when he saw them perform because he would be so happy, and had to be such an amazing thing for him to see his sons, going from him being, again, I think it was the type of thing in Holland where he played clarinet and saxophone, where he would get a solo. It would be like solo by Jan Van Halen, it'd be like such and such an orchestra with solos by Jan Van Halen, to where, again, he becomes basically an anonymous musician in Los Angeles, to where he can go to the LA Forum in 1979 and see Van Halen up in lights. It had to be incredibly satisfying to the father. And I think for Eddie, I think that was something that was, and I'm sure Alex too, they felt that was a real gift that they gave to their father, to see, look, all those years of laboring, and you basically shared your music with us, and you gave it all to help us, music lessons, piano lessons, these types of things, and look what we did with it. And so I think that had to be a driver for Eddie and Alex to basically carry forth the family tradition in a way that Jan couldn't succeed in America as the musician on the same level. It would be very satisfying. And
if you look on a personal level, character-wise and supportive-wise, Eddie and Jan, what can you say about that?
Yeah, I don't know a tremendous amount about the relationship between the brothers and their dad, other than he was a presence. I mean, you see a lot of pictures, and then the other thing that was really I thought a remarkable thing too was that what happened with Diver Down with Big Bad Bill is that they brought in Jan to play clarinet on the song, and that's the first appearance of three Van Halens on a record, which is kind of a cool prelude to what happens later with Wolfgang. And I do know that he was basically a constant presence around their shows, especially in Los Angeles. He would go to all the shows and was very proud. I actually heard an interview with a recorded interview that was done by a journalist with one of Eddie's college teachers, and talked about how he had met their father, been a music teacher from college, had met the father, and just how proud he was, and how that was obviously a great joy for the brothers and for Jan, is to have that musical bond.
And the bond with his mother, Eugenie?
Another interesting chapter in this is that, from what Eddie has talked about his mother, is that his mother was very dubious about this rock and roll thing, which I think is very funny. I mean, I think even like after they became big, big in 78, she was still like, Yeah, but when are you going to get a real, like, basically, when are you going to get a real music gig? So, I think she was probably, I think, living with the experience of having Jan go from being a very, very prominent musician in Holland to becoming a guy who had to be out till 2 a.m. playing in nightclubs in Los Angeles, and then she saw her sons do that for years. And supposedly she was very, very much like very against it. Wanted them to go to college, and they did. They actually, they attended college. The brothers, both of them did. But that's the stories that you sometimes hear from Eddie, is that she was even after, I guess she saw them at like the Anaheim Stadium and still was like, well, when are you going to basically, get a real, not a real job, but just basically like, this thing's not going to last, And of course, she, in some levels, she probably wasn't wrong, meaning that, most bands, as we know, do 1 or 2 records and they break up and it never goes. And, the idea that Van Halen would become an international institution of music is probably something, but, she was probably less enthused by their music than the father.
Yeah, and I heard that I read somewhere that she actually warned Eddie several times, well, don't become like your dad, some kind of, someone who didn't make it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's the important thing, is that, to have that experience where you can see how hard it is. And I think, I would love to talk to Alex about this and maybe ask him, like, it had to be very demoralizing for the father. It had to be, and I'm sure for Eddie's mother as well, to have to see the struggle, to go from being a prominent musician to being a dishwasher and a janitor was, at first, when they got to the States, that stays with you, to say, this is, go to college or become a classical pianist. And that's what what she wanted for the brothers, was if they're going to do music, she wanted them, coming on the stage with everyone dressed in suits and them in a tuxedo playing Mozart on the piano or something, not playing rock and roll, but it worked out just fine. I think they talked about, they bought her a house, and she, obviously, she she must have understood. She must have understood that it was, Van Halen wasn't going away. After a few years, she must have understood that I think it's working.
True, but the thing is that she said about the guitar playing of Eddie that it's Eddie crying and
right, the loud, right,
yeah.
right,
and that he said during some, I don't know, someone said it that he said, well, the crying and the whining bought her a house. So
yeah. I mean, I think it was fun. I mean, one person I interviewed for Van Halen Rising, and this would have been in the early 70s. They went to the house, and Eddie and Alex used to practice. If people know the Los Lunas house, people will say, "Oh, they practiced in the garage." It's not true. The garage in the back is it's like a walk-in closet. You couldn't practice in there. There was no way you could practice in there. You couldn't. A drum kit would basically be, it was like a 1-car garage, very, very, very small, almost like a shed. They used to practice in the living room. So if you imagine the Los Lunas house, the front door would open, and what I was told from Mark Stone, their bass player who passed away recently, the door would open. Basically, that was where the drums were. Like, you just walk in, and you're like, okay, and then the amp was there, and so you can imagine the mother. And the funny story I heard, they come to the house to watch Eddie and us practice. And they were in, like, freshmen or sophomores in high school or something. And they said, "Where's your mom?" And the brothers would say, "Oh, she's taking a nap." And, like, Eddie has the amp and the drum, and they're like, "She's taking a nap?" Like, has a pillow over her head or something like that. But I said, "Were they joking?" They said, "It didn't seem like they were joking. She was taking a nap." So I can imagine she was just sick of the noise. I mean, eventually, of course, they went to other places to practice, but when they were in high school, they practiced in the house with Mark Stone, with the bass amp. They practiced. This was when they first, like 1970, 71, when they first started, they were practicing in the living room. Yeah. So you can imagine, like, Ampeg cabinet, big amp, huge drum set. That was the practice.
Yeah, and I will come back to that later. I have ordered your book, so I haven't read it yet, but sure. I will from A to Z. What I found interesting in your manifesto that you wrote is that the story is not about suddenly they are there in 1978 right. with the album.
Right.
What was for you? What were the defining moments, defining years of Van Halen prior to their first album?
Yeah, for me, I think the 1976 year, I'll single that out. I could talk about a lot of stuff, but that was the year that they decided to stop playing other people's music exclusively or heavily and playing their own music. So that was when they took the plunge to become an all originals band, and that happened around the summer of 1976.
Why?
And what I mean by that, because they sort of realized that you can't go anywhere as a cover band. And I say that is that it's interesting because in terms of having a steady income, they probably were making generally decent money playing backyard parties. Then they went to playing in Hollywood. They probably were making less money, but they could play regularly playing ZZ Top or Edgar Winter songs. They played covers, cover songs of the day, Steve Miller songs, these types of things. But what they decided to do is say, okay, we're gonna start only playing as a band that plays Running with the Devil, Somebody Get Me a Doctor, or Whiskey, Take Your Whiskey Home, these types of things. And that happened in around the summer of '76, and that was a huge risk in some ways. I mean, obviously it's like, that's what you do as a band, but that was basically where they said, okay, we can play it safe and become the greatest cover band in the history of Los Angeles and play clubs forever. They could have played, throughout the '70s, they could have played nightclubs because they were a great cover band. And that's where, it's basically, like you said about Eddie writing all this music, it became, put the cards on the table, so to speak. Here's what we have. Do people like it? And people did like the music, obviously, and they would basically play 4 or 5 sets at a place like Gazzari's, and they would slip in a couple of their own songs. But to basically go see Van Halen now at a local auditorium, or to see them at a nightclub in Hollywood where you got 95% Van Halen songs and 5% covers, where before it was the exact opposite. That was a huge, that was live or die by your own music, because obviously people could have said, I want to hear ZZ Top. I don't want to hear Somebody Get Me a Doctor. But that's not the way it worked. And, that was them going on the road, getting themselves on the path to, they meet Gene Simmons in 1976. He tries to get them a record deal. And so all that stuff happens. They basically going from largely a cover band to, by the end of the year, they're in the Whiskey. Within 6 months, they're in Whiskey A Go-Go, which is the premier platform at the time on the Sunset Strip. They were quote unquote nationally unknown band. They had a reputation in Los Angeles, but that was a big deal. If they had not made that switch, obviously that never would happen, because the Whiskey didn't book cover bands that played other people's music. You had to play original music.
Yeah. Certain other key moments. Let's start Genesis. What sort of band was that?
Yeah, Genesis was a cover band. That was Eddie, Alex, and Mark Stone. Mark Stone played bass with them from about 1971 to about 1974. So it was Eddie and Alex, and then they had they met a local musician, a guy who they went to high school with, and he joined the band. And so Genesis would have been playing, Friday night concerts at the park. They played some backyards. They were birthday parties, church basements. This would have been when the brothers were about 16 or 17 years old. They were basically high school kids. And that eventually morphed into a band called Mammoth. And Mammoth was the same lineup initially, but they changed the name because they discovered there was a band out of England called Genesis, which is another funny story. They went to the record store in 1971 or 72 and pulled a record. And they were, I guess there's another band called Genesis. We need to change our name to Mammoth. And then, so what ends up happening is they meet Roth. Roth tries to audition for them.
Who sang?
Oh, yeah, Eddie. Sorry, yeah, Eddie sang. Eddie sang and played guitar in Mammoth. Yeah, they were a 3-piece power trio. Proms they would play, school dances, these types of things. And they played, again, all covers. As far as I know, they played no original music at the time. But they also, the thing interesting about Mammoth and Genesis is that the dress, later on, of course, Van Halen became known for their very, very flamboyant outfits and stripes and spandex and all the different things they would wear on stage. But, people would talk to me about what it was like to see Van Halen. They basically wore like Pendleton shirts. They wore like plaid shirts and And geez, one person is very, very, very funny said to me, he said, Eddie and Alex looked like they just got off work at the gas station and then came to play a show at a prom. You know, they just basically, they didn't have any stage. It was no stage show or anything. It was just them. They just play, right? They just play. They literally walk, you know, what they wore to school, and they play.
And I can tell you, if you look at the 2015, that what they did for TV, I don't know what's called, Jimmy Kimmel. That's also just a T-shirt and trousers,
Yeah.
and then Roth
Yeah.
is the guy who dresses
Right.
up. Yeah,
right. I thought that was very interesting. Yeah, they almost like went back. They almost went back. Yeah, I think, you know, obviously that was Roth, and that's to Roth's credit. He definitely understood that the visual appearance makes a huge difference, and you have to put on a show. At that time, that was the expectation. Still the expectation today. I mean, we don't want to see Lady Gaga come out in like jeans and like a Gap T-shirt, do we? You know, that's not what we want. And so he was able to get those guys to dress differently and move differently. And that's the other thing too, I think it's worth noting, is that because Eddie sang, he couldn't move around a lot, but people talked about how Eddie would basically stand in basically almost one spot the entire time. He would step back to solo, he'd walk back to the microphone. You know, he didn't move. Where later they became such an athletic, Van Halen was such an athletic show where Roth really understood. I think Roth, you know, primarily they're playing in bigger spaces. People at the top need to be able to engage, and how you get engagement is by lots of motion, lots of movement, a lot of jumping. People can see you jump from the top of an arena, off an amp or off a drum riser, you know, and so they went from basically having no stage presence, so to speak, just standing there, to, after working with Roth, it became a totally different thing. But yeah, Genesis and Mammoth was a cover band, but they were a very good cover band, note for note. I talked to a lot of people who were musicians, guys who were rock musicians at the time, playing in bands, never went anywhere, obviously, but they were, you know, guys who played guitar and played cover bands, talking about how amazing Eddie and Alex were, playing every single note on the records.
and there's some sort of Eddie always states in interviews that Cream, Eric Clapton during his Cream time, and that influenced him as a guitar player, and Dave Clark 5, him and his brother. But
Yes.
Aaron Musper told me, and some other people also told me, that it was actually Led Zeppelin that really was their what they were really into. Is it true?
So here's what I think about all of that. I think they had a lot of influences, and I talk about that in great detail in Van Halen Rising. Eddie always pointed to Cream, and Alex always pointed to Cream. I think for them, it was sort of like me with rock music. I started with Van Halen. I really get into hard rock, and then listened to, you know, everything, you know, all this sort of stuff. That sort of opened up my mind to rock music. I mean, in other words, I didn't start listening to Deep Purple records until 1986 or something like that. I got into hard rock, and you're like, oh, I should listen to Deep Purple. I should listen to Black Sabbath. And, you know, so the starting point for them was Cream. And Eddie always talked about Clapton. I think part of that is that when you become such a renowned guitar god, everybody is looking for ways to demystify what you do. And I think for Eddie, it just became simpler to answer, I loved Clapton, which was true. He copied Clapton, which he did. But, you know, I think you listen, Iommi, Ritchie Blackmore, Tommy Bolin. And again, I'm not saying that Eddie is like hiding that. Jeff Beck, he talked about that in early interviews, but I think it became like, you know, instead of having to like go through a long laundry list, you just became Clapton. And Clapton was his god. You know, kind of like when I was a kid guitar player, Eddie Van Halen was that. But I also liked all these other guitar players too. Stevie Ray Vaughan, but I would always talk about Eddie first. The other thing to think about is that you know, about the Led Zeppelin thing, I think Erwin is right. I'm not so sure that Eddie loved Jimmy Page's guitar in his top 5 guitar players, but Alex for sure. Even after the first record, Ted Templeman told me they grumbled a little bit about the mix because Alex wanted it to sound more like Led Zeppelin, and Ted was like, no, whatever. Ted had a different vision for the mix, which obviously worked. But that's one of the reasons why Andy Johns was brought in, to create that big drum sound. And that's what Alex for him, the John Bonham thing, you know, and again, I don't think Erwin's wrong. I think for sure those guys were huge Zeppelin fans, but I just don't think for Eddie, my take on it was that Jimmy Page was in his top 5 influences. Of course, he played tons of Jimmy Page. They played tons of Zeppelin. They played.
Well, the thing is,
You know,
sorry, when I asked you the question, it dawned on me that actually Aaron said that Alex indeed gave him the box of Led Zeppelin and told him, well, listen to this, and then you know what. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely interesting, you know, and when they did the record in 1991 with Andy Johns, you know, I've talked to Don Landy about this. That was basically, you know, Don basically said, this is what I do. This is what I sound like. If you want, you know, and that's why they brought in Andy Johns, and they basically let Don go after all those years, in part, I think, because Alex wanted a different drum sound. Again, I don't know for sure exactly what the thing was, but for sure, Andy gave much more of a Led Zeppelin sound to Van Halen than Don had done in the records. And I love the Don production records. You know, he really produced 5150 with Eddie. He produced 80812, and of course, he worked with Ted. You know, one of the best engineers of all time. But it was something different they wanted. And then what ended up happening is they brought in Ted Templeman to finish the record. You know, Ted was very good at getting records done. Great with vocals, great producer, but he was also extremely talented at understanding the project starts now and the project finishes now. And he can't spend, like, his albums, with some unusual exceptions, almost never went over.
Yeah.
You know, and so they brought in Templeman to do the vocals with Sammy and to finish the record. But if you notice, right, that sounds like that sounds like the Led Zeppelin drum. That's Andy engineered it. Andy, basically, they did the instrumental tracks with Andy, and then Ted came in and finished, basically helped pick the songs, do some arrangement, do the vocals, and they finished the record. But yeah, for sure. And Irwin's, I mean, the stuff he did with them in their mid 90s with you know, Can't Get the Stuff No More. And then did he do Twister with them too?
With Aaron, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff it's phenomenal sounding, phenomenal, just a genius engineer.
Yeah, and the one other key moment, we already discussed it a little bit. We delved upon it, but maybe just pinpoint it now. First meeting, David Lee Roth.
So yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the first meeting with David Lee Roth probably happened in a backyard where he came up to them and basically said, "I'm a singer, you know, I should sing for you guys," or something like that. And I just, you know, I think people need to understand that there was almost like it's a tribal thing in Los Angeles at the time. You know, they were basically like the, you know, the guys who like hard rock, and they liked muscle cars, and they drank this type of beer. And then Dave came up, and Dave went to a different high school, and he was much more, you know, he was much more flamboyant is the word always comes to mind. But he was, you know, he had different influences, how he talked, how he presented himself. He went to school with a lot of black students. So you can imagine they were looking at this guy like, are you for real? And then they, you know, they had him audition, and he was apparently terrible, which doesn't surprise me. But again, I think, you know, in retrospect, you probably understand that. I mean, it would probably had to have been like Frank Sinatra or something, like, you know, like Ian Gillan would have had to walk in the house and like blow them away. They didn't really want a singer. They just were like, oh yeah, okay, you can audition. They basically, you know, let him in, and they humiliated him, and he left. But he formed his own band called Red Ball Jet, which I always think is a very important and underappreciated. When I talk about, you know, in writing Van Halen Rising, a lot of stuff that happened with Red Ball Jet, which was Roth and 4 other guys he went to high school with. This is the band he had before Van Halen. A lot of that stuff ended up coming through in Van Halen later. You know, there was a you know, he wanted to do dance steps on the show, like a Motown step thing, where the, you know, like the Temptations or something. You know, later we watched the Hot for Teacher video. That's basically what Roth had them do. You know, and so he formed his own band. You know, they basically competed on the backyard party circuit. Mammoth was much better musically. You know, Mammoth would play like the whole first side of Live at Leeds by The Who. And so I'm not exaggerating. They played the whole thing, the whole 15-minute thing. And, you know, Roth's band would play Johnny B. Good and Rolling Stones, and they were okay, but they just, you know, were just more of a, you know, more generic with Roth, of course. And then eventually Roth started renting them the PA system. And as the story goes, Roth eventually, and I heard this from the guy who played keyboards with Mammoth at the time, eventually said one night, "Here's the deal, boys. If you don't let me sing, you can't have the the PA, and he did it in like the last minute. Basically, they came to pick it up at like 6 o'clock, and they had to set up by 7 o'clock. And Roth, to his credit, basically looked up, stared Alex in the eye and goes, "Unless you let me sing, you can't have it." I'm sure Alex wanted to kill him, but Alex was like, "Fine." And that's supposedly how it started. He let them sing, and eventually he talked them into it. And, the thing is that Roth probably recognized as well what they were missing. And also Alex, and particularly, knew that Eddie, as he says, was not cut out to be a frontman. He couldn't do it. He just couldn't, he wasn't a very good singer. And I don't mean he couldn't sing, but he was not anything interesting as a singer. And it was very difficult to be able to obviously to sing lead, play the leads, play rhythm guitar. It was a lot for him to carry. And so they eventually realized they needed Roth. And as out there as Roth was to a lot of their local fans, which is another thing that's very interesting to me, is that, of course, at the time, nobody outside of Pasadena heard of Van Halen or the little neighborhoods they were from. But to their local fans, the few hundred kids who liked them, this was a terrible thing that they did. It's like I don't know how to explain it. It's like I'm not exaggerating. It probably would have been similar to someone saying, "Hey, did you see who Motley Crue hired as the new singer? It's George Michael from Wham!" or something. And people are like, what are they doing? They've ruined the band. And I think that was kind of the attitude. A lot of these guys were like, but I don't want to say that people understand. I had a couple people tell me that Eddie particularly would stick up for Dave and be like, "We need this guy," to the friends, basically being like, "Oh, come on, you should sing, get rid of this guy. You don't need him." And he's like, "We need this guy. We need him." And it worked. It worked. And so I always think that's another kind of underappreciated thing about the brothers, is that, as much as they thought Roth was unusual, they saw something in him. Even if he wasn't the greatest vocalist, he had a certain charisma and a certain talent that they needed. And that's what made Van Halen successful. I think for me, always the big takeaway about Van Halen is that I always think Eddie and Alex could have become great. They could have been like progressive rock musicians. They could have been like playing with Alan Holdsworth, or, they could have had, that type, they could have played that type of music, a Jeff Beck thing. Maybe they would have made it with another singer. But I always think, that it took obviously both parts of the pieces of the puzzle to make Van Halen. You had the incredible musicality and the discipline that the brothers had. And then you had Roth with the creativity of sort of thinking outside the box in terms of the type of music they would do. Because look, if Roth hadn't come along, I have no reason to think that they still wouldn't have been doing what at the time would have been sort of like progressive metal. They would have been playing like Black Sabbath, and they would have been playing Captain Beyond, and sort of the stuff that, that was much more musician-esque hard rock, rather than sort of the pop stuff. Like Roth got them to do James Brown and Edgar Winter and the stuff that they wouldn't have done. They were much more into like let's jam for 15 minutes and play everything perfectly.
And legend has it that Rod said to them, "Well, we need to make rock music that you can dance to."
Definitely. I mean, definitely true. Definitely true. And he had already, one of the great things about interviewing the guys from his band, the Red Ball Jet Band, he had already auditioned at Gazzarri's. So before Van Halen got to Gazzarri's in 1974, in 1972 or so, Van Halen was nowhere near the Sunset Strip, but Dave had already auditioned. His band failed the audition, but he actually, again, they learned the Motown step. He wanted to put on a show for Bill Gazzarri, the famous Sunset Strip club owner. And, they failed the audition, but he was already pushing them to do a stage show and to play. Again, you can't go to nightclubs on the Sunset Strip as a cover band and expect people who are there to dance and have drinks to listen to you do "I'm So Glad" by Cream from the live album with 14 minutes of solos and jams. People are going to be like, they want to hear the next song. It's like a jukebox. Yeah. It's the next song. Where's the next hit? I want to hear the hits. And Roth knew that, and he sort of got them thinking about pop songs. That's the Van Halen magic formula. It was kind of streamlined and finalized by Templeman, but they already had it. It was 3-minute songs, incredible guitar solos, wild vocals, but pop songs.
Do you think In hindsight, strange question, of course, but do you think the brothers liked this new direction?
I think I think there was pushback, and interestingly enough, when Roth first joined, they wanted him to sing some of the stuff they were doing. I mean, Roth didn't come to the band. They didn't initially say like, let's do all of the stuff that you want to do. But after they started having to audition at nightclubs to make money, and Roth was right. I mean, again, so many things that Roth did in terms of helping to direct their career were so right. You know, he basically said to them, look, we could play backyards, and they were making great money playing backyards. I think it's people to understand. They would make sometimes $100 for 3-4 hours of work at the time. It's a huge amount of money, you know, because what was happening is that you would have a party, Martin, and you would have a flyer that say, Martin's house, Van Halen, $1, all the beer you can drink. And so you were going to have 500 people come to the house, and they knew you were going to get $500 cash. You give the band 20% of the money. I mean, that was huge money in 1972 and they split it, you know, but think about it. It's a few, like $400 or $500 today, $600. So they could have done that every weekend and made a living at that. Roth's like, we can't be doing this in 1976. So as a thing, so Roth pushed them to go to nightclubs. And once that happened, he was like, look at the top 40, guys. Look what's in the top 40. We got to play Seals and Crofts. We have to play whatever it is that's the hit of the day. We have to start playing it. And again, they played stuff that was more suited to their style, but they played like, you know, Guess Who. They played things that were America. I'm sure they played a lot of things that at the time were something the brothers never would have wanted to play. But they needed eventually they needed to have enough music for 5 45-minute sets. So figured out about 9 songs. You know, it's a lot. It's like 40 or 50 songs you have to rotate through in a night. In theory, you could probably repeat some at the end of the night, but that was, so you had to have short pop songs, and that's what got you the gigs at the nightclubs. And so Roth was pushing them that way. But then once, you know, he started opening up the idea that we should play the Sunset Strip, because again, I've heard Alex talk about that. He's like, Hollywood. We didn't want to go to Hollywood to play. There was weirdos in Hollywood. That was, you know, it was glitter. It was the glam era. There was people, men dressed as women. There was glitter clothes. There was big platform shoes. It was like David Bowie-esque thing where they were like, they didn't want anything to do with that. Roth was into that stuff, into the David Bowie and stuff like that. But he got them thinking about it differently. And I think the brothers would continue to impose upon Roth to sing a Black Sabbath song now and then, but that was not Roth's forte and not what he wanted to do. But you know, you go from, you know, your Gazaris, it's the end of the night, you play a Beatles song, and then you play a Black Sabbath song because there's 17 people there and they're all drunk, and you play a Black Sabbath song because Alex wants to play one. Then you go and you play a Steely Dan song or something like that.
Do you think what made them stick out so long? I mean, at least until 1984, because I think the personalities, were a bit, they're not really clicked. I think Roth and Eddie.
Well, I mean, I think once you become a big band like that, there's a lot of pressure from the record company and from management. I mean, everybody has a stake in it, and I think that's the other thing is too. It's even if you have disagreements and lots of tension inside the band, I think there was also a sense they recognized they were getting bigger. Certainly that's something else. You know, it's kind of hard to say we should break up a band when we're getting bigger. It's easier to go like, our career is going nowhere and I hate this guy, let's break up the band. You know, and I think that when you have 40 or 50 guys working for you and you have fans out there, all the pressure is on stay together, right? It's difficult to think about the fracturing. And, you know, you also getting caught in the record, you're in a record contract and things like that. But, you know, I've heard Eddie talk about how he was so frustrated he wanted to quit the band. I mean, again, I think we've all been in situations in a relationship with a woman or something, or a man, you're like, I want to leave this relationship. And then you like walk out of the house and 20 minutes later, you're like, okay, no, I don't. So I don't ever think that there was ever like a plot for Eddie to quit. Like, he's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to quit. We're going to get a new singer in 1980 or something like that. But, you know, it was a difficult thing because, you know, I think everybody knows it's just you put Eddie Van Halen in a room with David Lee Roth, they can kind of play the roles within Van Halen, but they didn't have a lot in common. They just were very different. And so and especially I think when Roth, there was the sense that Roth was using Van Halen as a platform. I mean, literally like using the name Van Halen. And that's really important to understand. The brothers using their name, using their band, which they considered to be theirs in kind of a sense that we formed the band as a platform in 1985 to do a solo career. I think that was the bridge really for them. That really was we needed to make a change. That was, that whole period of time that was changed things a lot with Roth's solo career. And I think that was the thing that really, where they felt as if Roth was stepping out and using the band as a way to increase his own fame, was something that was really, really an irritant, and really something they just wouldn't accept.
Yeah, and Eddie once said, I think that he tried to be friends with Roth, but Roth really didn't let him get close enough.
I mean, I've never spoken to David Lee Roth before, but I think anytime we've heard interviews with him, there's always the question of, where does Dave start and Diamond Dave stop? It's not a, I think I've heard from a lot of people that occasionally you could get Roth, alone, and he would kind of drop the persona, right? But, I can imagine within the context of the band, you're still, even in a band meeting, you're still playing. I'm not saying he's acting like David Lee Roth, but it's like, that's your identity. Again, it's sort of like, where Dave would be like, with somebody and kind of away from other people. And it's sort of like that goes down. And I wonder if that's part of what ended up happening, was just sort of you just become these figures that are so, you're famous, and you're just sort of, it just becomes, you can't have a normal conversation sometimes with people. And I'm sure that happens in I'm sure that happens in a lot of bands. But for Dave and for Eddie, I don't think there ever really was a tight friendship. It was always Alex and Eddie. But I suspect as Roth's fame grew, it probably became even more incomprehensible in terms of what, the relationship. I mean, I just think the perfect example is that Dave wanted them to make a movie, and Eddie and Alex were like, "What? Make a movie?" And for Roth, look, it makes perfect sense. Rick Springfield was in the movies. Prince was in the movies. In 1985, John Cougar was trying to make a movie. Madonna was in the movies. I mean, you can go through like everyone, Tina Turner. I go through a huge list of people who wanted to make movies. But Eddie and Alex were like, we're musicians. We don't want to be like, we don't want to make like a Hard Day's Night where we're running up and down a hill and fast. To them, that was just what? So I think that's part of the thing too, is that, there's how do you connect with somebody on an emotional close level as a friend when it's like, it'd be like my wife going, coming in the house, "Hey, we should move to Finland, North Finland." Finland's a beautiful country. I'd like to visit there. I'd be like, "What? What do you mean you want to?" "I'm from America. I don't want to move to Finland." "No, we got to move to Finland. It's going to be great." And she's like coming home every day and talking about Finland. And you're like, "I don't want to move to Finland." And you're like, "Well, guess what? Yeah. I'm going to get some other guys and we're moving to Finland." And that's what they said. He did basically.
Yeah, that's true. If you look at that interview that they did with the three of them, the conversation, I don't know if you've seen it, black and white.
Yes.
2012. There's typical stuff over there. You see Alex in the middle, Greg. Yep. You see Eddie as the little brother, more like this, his body language, and you could Dave ask you a question and not even waiting for the answer from the brothers to come, but just to answer the question himself. I think that sums it up. Yeah,
for sure. That's actually the radio. That one was very interesting because the radio interviews that they did together sometimes, were much more like they were drunk and it was a rowdy thing. Like it's in the back of the 80s, they would do these radio interviews together. That was kind of a thing where Van Halen went to the radio station and it was like, "Oh, Van Halen's here." And they brought two strippers and they just did this whole show. But to have them actually sit and talk, you're right. Those are very, very illuminating because you didn't see that too often. There's also an interview people should look from 1978 in London. I think it was done in London. It's a video interview and somebody or some TV station put on YouTube they're all sitting on a park bench, and you can see the personalities there as well. Where Dave is, Eddie talks, Alex talks, and you can definitely see some of the personalities there too.
Yeah, and I found it really interesting just because the brothers, Alex and Eddie is sometimes looking at Alex, and then he's actually the little brother. You could see it.
Yes.
Yeah. Two more questions. We've spoken about Jump, of course.
Sure.
Van Halen, the first album.
Yes, sir.
Van Halen, the first album. What was the impact?
Massive impact. One of the reasons why I so wanted to do the book with Templeman was that I was interested in his entire career. Doobie Brothers, Van Halen. He was one of the few producers to take three people from complete obscurity, artists, to heights of fame. That would be Doobie Brothers, Van Halen, and then Nicolette Larson, who had a good career, 2 or 3 hit records in the early 80s, late 70s. When Ted would talk about Van Halen, it was like a different type of intensity to his conversation. I mean, he loved the Doobie Brothers, but for whatever, because Van Halen was really his baby, and I just mean that he discovered them, quote unquote, discovered them, saw them, got them on Warner Brothers. He had them from ground zero. The first Doobie Brothers record, he worked with Lenny Waronker, who was a great producer as well. They kind of partnered on, then he went on from there. But, talking about the making of that record with him, and then just understanding as well, just the impact it had beyond the making of the record. It for me, it's something I could write or talk about for the rest of my life. It's just the songs, the playing, the production, the visuals, the album cover with the very, very, very unique, the blurring of the images with the color strip smears on them, which was done with the camera lens. It wasn't done with the Photoshop. It was done with the photographer's name is Elliot. His last name is escaping me, but first name is Elliot. Great. I mean, they were just like, moving and the blurring. It was so different from what came at the time before. And I talk a lot about that in Van Halen Rising. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to write that book, was to give, to kind of really lay down the history, to let people know where these guys came from, how hard they worked to make it. And then when they made this record, it was so impactful on people, from guitar players to radio. And then, of course, to go to the late 80s, mid 80s, where the Van Halen sound becomes it becomes everywhere. Everyone's copying Van Halen.
Yeah, and if you look back on that, maybe you can give some sort of, what was music like in 1978, and then
Sure.
Van Halen came.
Sure.
What was different?
For sure.
Yeah. What was different? What they did?
Oh, sorry. What was different? Sorry. For 1978, I mean, I think you think about what was on the radio was soft rock and disco were really, really, really popular. And the other thing that I would always point people to is that people thought that punk rock and new wave music was going to be the big future trend in music. And disco was super popular. I mean, even in 1979, when Van Halen 2 was on the charts, the number one album at one point was Donna Summer's Bad Girls was the number one hit. I mean, that was the big hit. So for them to come out and have that sort of impact was remarkable, because it was not easy. They were not putting music out there that was already popular. They were doing something different.
And if you look at the songs, what are the standout songs of that album?
The standout songs for me, Eruption for sure, Running with the Devil is always, I think, something that they played basically on every single tour they ever went on, I think, pretty much. And that was the other one too. But the whole album from front to back, I mean, that's the other thing too, is there's not a clunker on the album. There's no filler. And that's the other thing that makes Van Halen 1 remarkable, is that you could look to pretty much any hit album from most artists, especially debut. You always can find like 1 or 2 songs that maybe are filler, but there's a few, like Led Zeppelin, The Doors, Van Halen, Guns N' Roses. You kind of go through and there's really not filler. All the songs are quality. And so that's something to me that stands out as well, to have a first album like that that's so powerful and isn't just like you have a hit, there's a couple other good songs, then you build a career from that. They started with already, an album. If they had never made another album again, we'd still be talking about it.
3 short questions, and then we're done. The Dutch roots. How important were the Dutch roots to Eddie?
I think it's something that he stuck with his entire life in terms of the language. I think that's one thing to think about is occasionally you would hear him say in interviews and he would say a Dutch word and he'd say, well, it doesn't really translate well into English. It means this. And Alex would be there and they'd laugh and they'd nod and and talk about that. And, I believe Valerie and Eddie honeymooned there. I think at some point, kind of 2 or 3 years after they got married, they went to Holland and did an interview, did their honeymoon there. And the other thing too, I was going to say about interviews is that they were always pretty good about doing Dutch radio that, and they would actually, it's great. You go on YouTube, you can hear the brothers. This had been like 1980, 1979, 1983, doing interviews in Dutch. It was something that was important to them that they never forgot. I mean, it was never a thing where they left that behind. It was always part of their cultural identity and who they were.
Yeah. Eddie as a guitar player, how would you sum him up?
Eddie is a guitar player, completely revolutionary in so many different ways, but I'd summarize it in saying technically as a guitar player, brought the guitar from Jimi Hendrix being the kind of the prototype guitar god to a whole different level with Eddie Van Halen, with the tapping, the artificial harmonics, and the legato style. In terms of his ability as a craftsman, I mean, he built his own guitars, he modified amps, he came up with all sorts of experimental things that, experimenting with voltage through the variac, the variable AC unit as well to change the guitar sound. And then the songwriting. I mean, that's the thing. He wrote so many riffs. I mean, it's kind of, I think, hard to overstate the fact that, you think about someone like Jimmy Page, if you want to compare to Led Zeppelin, I mean, there's very few guys other than Eddie and Jimmy Page and maybe Tony Iommi who wrote that many incredible riffs. I mean, Blackmore is one of the greatest guitar players of all time. He didn't write that many great riffs. I mean, meaning like riffs that you could list 25 great Eddie Van Halen riffs. I couldn't really list 25 great Blackmore riffs that are that, yes, I think Iommi, Jimmy Page, to me, that's the other thing too, is all those pieces together, the songwriting, the technical ability on the guitar as a player, but also as a craftsman who built his own guitars and modified his amps.
Yeah. Eddie is a human being.
Hey, I just sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I have to cut this. My battery is almost dead and I'm not in a position to plug in.
Last question. This really is the last question. Eddie as a human being, as a person, how would you describe him?
Eddie as a human being, creative, sensitive, and someone who struggled with substances, as we know, which I think at times brought out some things that people don't maybe appreciate were symptoms of a disease. I mean, people talk about how he treated this person, that person, but when you talk to people about Eddie Van Halen, I'll tell you one quick anecdote. Hopefully I get this in here, is that he was kind. He there was a story I was told. One of the guys he grew up with in the neighborhood in the early 90s, guys from the neighborhood invited Eddie to play golf. And Eddie actually came to play golf in Pasadena with them. And again, at this time, Eddie's biggest rock star in the world, played golf. And when they were leaving, one of the guys said to Eddie, hey, you should wish this guy a happy birthday. It's his birthday in 2 days or something like that. And he's like, oh, it's your birthday? Happy birthday. And he said, oh, yeah, so where do you live in? I'm going to come by and see you guys at some point, you and your wife. Where do you live in? He's like, I live on the street or whatever, Okay. So 2 days later, the guy tells me a truck pulls up in front of the house and the guy gets the loading dock on the back of the truck, the metal. And he's like, did my wife order a new dishwasher, refrigerator? He was actually mad. He's like, she went and ordered a new dishwasher. I can't believe it. No, Eddie had sent from the PV, the amps. They sent, basically the guy was a guitar player and Eddie gifted this guy like the whole Eddie Van Halen riff. And so very generous, helped people out. And I think that's the thing is obviously when you're a public figure, you look back on certain periods of time in people's life and you sort of say, oh, wow, that doesn't seem like he was a great guy. But when people tell you about the Eddie Van Halen, who was personal, kind, helpful, and a caring person, that kind of sticks with you. And those are the stories that you kind of hear, that you kind of can separate out that, Eddie had his moments where he was not well. But the rest of it, when he was in his right in good frame of mind and good health. It was, he was especially generous person.
Yeah. Last question. How come do you think he was sometimes not well and he was struggling with substance abuse?
That's always a question that is hard to assess, because you're not around when they're little, but I do know that Eddie has talked about that story where his father, he got bit by a dog and he was bleeding. He was about 12 years old maybe, and his father gave him a shot of vodka and a cigarette. And, I think that's the thing is that, there was definitely an introduction to alcohol. I don't know by whoever, it's, father, it's not clear to me who exactly that was, but there was, I think alcohol became a thing that helped Eddie with his stage nervousness and helped, someone who's shy become more uninhibited. And, that story kind of stuck with me because it makes you think about, when you're drinking that young to sort of dull pain, how that can become a crutch, to sort of say, if I drink this, I'll feel better. But yeah, I mean, he, to his credit, sober for the last decade of his life, at least. And you really have to say that's a miracle because he was definitely somebody who struggled heavily with his addictions.
Yeah. Greg, may I thank you?
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.